Imagine the shore of a lake in northern Minnesota. It is late autumn, 1850. The air is already bitter, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. And along that shoreline, in makeshift camps, with no real shelter and almost no food, nearly 3,000 people are waiting. They have been waiting for weeks. They were promised payment. They were promised supplies. They were promised protection. But what they got instead was spoiled pork, rotting in barrels, water-soaked flour no human being could eat, and a government agent who simply never showed up. By the time the first snow fell hard on Sandy Lake, something like 150 people had already perished, not in battle, not in any dramatic confrontation, just quietly in the cold from dysentery and measles and starvation. And when those who survived finally turned around and tried to walk home, hundreds more would meet their fate on the trail. The west bank of Big Sandy Lake, they say, appeared white from a distance that winter, like it was dusted with snow. But it was not snow, it was the bones of the dead. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are diving into one of the most deliberately forgotten atrocities in American history, the Sandy Lake tragedy of 1850. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell, because we cover the stories the textbooks leave out. Now let us get into it. Most Americans have heard of the Trail of Tears, and they should. More than 4,000 Cherokee, Seminole, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw men, women, and children perished during a series of forced removals from the southeastern United States to what is now Oklahoma. That chapter of American history has been taught, debated, and memorialized. But what happened to the Ojibway of the Great Lakes region in 1850? That story rarely makes it into the classroom. And what makes it even more disturbing is that it was not the result of open warfare or even a military campaign. It was the result of a bureaucratic trap, a scheme cooked up in government offices by men in suits designed to break a people through cold, hunger, and calculated neglect. To understand how it happened, you have to go back a few decades. By the 17th century, the Ojibway nation, also known as the Chippewa, had spread across a vast territory along the shores of Lake Superior. Their community stretched from modern-day Ontario in the east all the way through Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to the west. These were not wandering bands. These were established nations with trade networks, spiritual centers, and deep territorial roots. Their cultural and economic heart was La Pointe, a community on Madeline Island in Lake Superior, in what is now Wisconsin. This was where annuity payments had always been distributed. This was where the Ojibway gathered each year to collect what the government owed them under treaty law. But by the middle of the 19th century, something had shifted. European American settlers were pushing into Wisconsin and Minnesota in growing numbers. And as they settled, they grew increasingly hostile to the idea of sharing territory with the Ojibway. Political pressure mounted. Congressmen from the region began demanding action. And in the administration of President Zachary Taylor, certain high-ranking officials decided to act. Now here is where the story gets dark. And I want you to stay with me because the details of what they planned matter. The policy that led to the Sandy Lake tragedy was not improvised. It was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate scheme, designed specifically to drive the Ojibway out of Wisconsin and Michigan by manipulating them into relocating themselves. The architects of this plan included Secretary of the Interior Thomas Ewing, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Orlando Brown, Minnesota Territory Governor Alexander Ramsey, and a sub-agent named John Watrous. These men knew exactly what they were doing, and they kept it secret from local citizens and from the Ojibway themselves. Here is what they decided. Instead of distributing the annual annuity payments at La Pointe, where they had always been paid, the Bureau of Indian Affairs would move the payment location to Sandy Lake, Minnesota. Sandy Lake was deep in the interior, far from the Ojibway homelands in Wisconsin and Michigan. It was isolated. It was difficult to reach, and the plan was to bring thousands of Ojibway to Sandy Lake in the late fall, delay their payments until winter had set in, and then rely on the cold and their inability to leave to grind down their resistance to permanent relocation. Think about what that means. These officials deliberately planned to strand thousands of people in a remote location in the middle of winter, without adequate food or shelter, and wait for suffering to do what policy could not. And they never breathed a word of it to the Ojibway or to the American public. But there is a piece of this story that most people do not know. And this is the first open question I want to leave with you. Why did so many Ojibway actually make the journey to Sandy Lake in the first place, when many of them had serious doubts about going? The answer tells you everything about the impossible situation they had been placed in. By the spring of 1850, the news that the annuity payment location had been changed spread through the Ojibway communities. Alarm spread with it. Tribal leaders gathered to deliberate. The discussions were long and serious, as they should have been. These chiefs understood that accepting this change could be read as accepting relocation. But those deliberations came at a cost. The talking went on so long that many bands were not able to plant their regular spring crops. When autumn came, they had little food stored. They were already facing a difficult winter before any of this began. And the annuity payments, the food, the goods, the supplies promised to them under their treaties, they needed those to survive. The government had engineered a situation where going to Sandy Lake was the only real option they had. In the fall of 1850, representatives from 19 Ojibway bands packed up their families and made the long, difficult journey to Sandy Lake. By late October, close to 3,000 people had gathered on its shores, waiting for the government agent and the supplies that had been promised to them. The agent did not come. Weeks passed. The temperature dropped. The makeshift camps along the lake offered little real shelter from the Minnesota autumn. Food began to run short. The provisions that had been stockpiled for the Ojibway were in large part already spoiled. Pork barrels had been soaked through. Flour was damaged and inedible. Dysentery ripped through the camps. Measles followed, and still the agent did not come. It was early December before a small portion of the payment finally arrived. 6 weeks. 6 weeks these people had been camped at Sandy Lake with inadequate food, in worsening cold, watching their children and elders get sick and die. By the time any money changed hands, roughly 150 Ojibway had already perished right there on the shores of that lake. Now the question is, what do you do when you are 1,500 miles from home? You have just watched 150 of your people perish. Winter has fully set in, and the rivers have frozen, so you cannot even use your canoes. You walk. That is what thousands of Ojibway did in December of 1850. They turned their backs on Sandy Lake, and they walked home. They had no real choice. They had no food reserves. Many were already sick. They had sold their blankets to buy provisions from traders along the way, just to keep their children from starving. And the journey home was brutal. Between 200 and 230 more Ojibway met their fate before they reached their home territories. By January of 1851, the total death toll had climbed to somewhere around 400 souls. Roughly 12% of the entire Lake Superior Chippewa population, gone in the span of a few months. And I want to pause here for a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with that number. 12%. If 12% of any modern city's population perished due to deliberate government negligence in a matter of months, it would be the defining catastrophe of a generation. For the Ojibway, it was something that happened quietly, in the interior of Minnesota, far from the eyes of most Americans, and it barely made it into the history books. Have you ever heard of this event before today? Drop a comment below. I want to know how many of you had any idea this happened. Because if you did not, that silence itself is part of the story. The Ojibway did not accept this in silence. They were outraged, as they had every right to be, and they made sure their voices reached the right people. The Lake Superior Chippewa bands, under the leadership of an elder chief, known as Chief Buffalo of La Pointe, organized what would become one of the most remarkable acts of diplomatic persistence in the history of the American frontier. Chief Buffalo and his council drafted a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington. It was signed on November of 1851 by more than 24 tribal leaders, and the words of that letter are extraordinary in their dignity and their controlled fury. The chiefs described how they had been summoned to Sandy Lake with promises of food and swift payment. They described how they found instead spoiled provisions that made their people sick. They described waiting 2 months for an agent who arrived late and paid them only a fraction of what was owed. They described throwing away their canoes because the rivers had frozen, walking home on foot with their families, selling their blankets to buy food, and arriving home to count their dead. 170 had perished at Sandy Lake itself, 230 more on the journey home. The letter delivered those numbers to Washington, plainly without embellishment, because no embellishment was needed. But Chief Buffalo did not stop at letters. In 1852, at the age of around 80 years old, he led a delegation of Ojibway chiefs on a journey by canoe from Wisconsin all the way to Washington, D.C. to personally appeal to President Millard Fillmore. They arrived in the capital, presented their petition, and they were heard. President Fillmore rescinded the removal order. The Ojibway would not be forced to Sandy Lake again. Now let us talk about what came after, because the Sandy Lake tragedy, as devastating as it was, became a turning point that shaped the Ojibway future in ways that are still visible today. Chief Buffalo returned from Washington not just with a cancellation of the removal order, but with a new strategic vision. He became one of the most effective advocates for the establishment of permanent reservations within the Ojibway traditional territories. His argument was pragmatic and farsighted. If the Ojibway were going to survive in a political environment where their land was constantly at risk, they needed to secure legal, recognized homelands that could not simply be revoked by an administrative order. And he pursued that goal relentlessly. The result was the Treaty of La Pointe in 1854. Under this agreement, the Lake Superior Chippewa bands achieved their primary objective. They were legally guaranteed the right to remain within their traditional territories. Reservations were established at locations that already had established Ojibway communities. Among those created were Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, Red Cliff, La Courtoreys, Bad River, Lac Vieux Desert, Lens, Ontonagon, and Lac du Flambeau. These were not distant alien territories. These were places the Ojibway already called home. A year later, the Treaty of Washington in 1855 established additional reservations in Minnesota for the Pillager Chippewa bands, including Leech Lake, Cass Lake, Lake Winnipegashish, Mill Lacs Lake, Sandy Lake, Pokegama Lake, Rabbit Lake, Gull Lake, and Rice Lake. But not everyone agreed to the treaty, and this is where the story takes another turn. Two bands, the St. Croix Band and the Mole Lake Band, refused to sign. They held out, hoping the United States would finally honor the promises that had already been broken so many times. They refused relocation and refused to aggregate with larger bands under the treaty terms. And for that refusal, they paid an enormous price. Both bands lost their federal recognition entirely. Without federal recognition, they had no legal standing, no treaty rights, no government-to-government relationship with the United States. They were effectively rendered invisible in the eyes of American law. They would not regain that recognition until the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, what historians sometimes call the Indian New Deal. During those decades without recognition, the Mole Lake Band became loosely associated with the Lac du Flambeau Reservation. The St. Croix Band was split and scattered, associated with La Courtoreille, Mille Lacs, and other reservations. And when the U.S. Army forcibly removed a portion of the St. Croix Band to Gull Lake in central Minnesota, using authority under the Indian Removal Act, even though that act had been officially concluded, Chief Bagon Gijig of the Gull Lake Band fought back, the only way left to him. He allied his people with the Dakota during the Dakota War of 1862. That conflict ended badly for nearly everyone involved. The Mississippi Chippewa were uprooted, yet again relocated first near Leech Lake, and eventually to the White Earth Indian Reservation, far from the places they had always lived. The machinery of removal ground forward for decades, even after the Sandy Lake tragedy had been documented, even after the public had expressed outrage, even after presidents had signed orders saying, it would stop. The grinding continued because the economic incentives that had driven the original scheme were still there. Local traders wanted Ojibway annuity, money spent in Minnesota. Territorial officials wanted the patronage contracts for supplying reservations. Land speculators wanted the Wisconsin and Michigan territories cleared. The Sandy Lake scheme had failed in its immediate goal, but the broader pressure on Ojibway lands continued for generations. That is worth thinking about. What does it tell us about the relationship between economic interest and official policy on the American frontier? Because Sandy Lake was not an accident. It was not the result of one rogue official or a logistical failure. It was a planned policy built on financial self-interest, executed at the expense of thousands of human lives. And when you know that, it changes how you read the history of American expansion more broadly. I want to hear your thoughts on that in the comments. Do you think decisions like these were exceptions, or were they built into the system itself? Today, Sandy Lake is a quiet place. There is a 32-acre tract of officially recognized reservation land there, home to a small community of Ojibway who have lived near those shores without interruption for generations. The lake itself is still rich with fish. Wild rice still grows along its edges. The Sandy Lake Dam, first built as a wooden structure in 1895 and replaced with a concrete structure in 1911, still controls water levels there. Around the lake, expensive vacation homes have replaced the small family resorts that defined the 20th century economy on the water. Visitors come for the fishing and the scenery, and most of them have no idea what happened there in the winter of 1850. On October 12, 2000, the United States erected a memorial at the Sandy Lake Dam campgrounds, operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, to commemorate the tragedy. Minnesota added a state historical marker in 2001 titled the Ojibway Sandy Lake Journey. Part of that marker carries the words of Eshki Buggy Kashi, the Ojibway leader, also known as Flatmouth, spoken directly to Governor Ramsey on December 3, 1850, the day the surviving Ojibway began their long walk home. He said, "Tell him I blame him for the children we have lost." 7 words. Tell him I blame him. That is the entire moral weight of the Sandy Lake tragedy distilled into a single sentence. No elaboration required, and that brings us back to where we started. That shoreline in late autumn, the white ground that was not snow, the 3,000 people who came to Sandy Lake because the government told them to, because they needed the annuities their treaties guaranteed, because they had no other realistic choice. They came in good faith. They were received with calculated neglect, and 400 of them never went home. The Sandy Lake tragedy does not appear in most American history textbooks. It does not carry the cultural recognition of the Trail of Tears. There are no major films about Chief Buffalo's 800-mile canoe journey to Washington at 80 years old to personally demand justice from the president. But the event is real. The death toll is documented. The letters survive. And the Ojibway community at Sandy Lake is still there, on 32 acres of recognized land, living in the shadow of a history that most of their neighbors have never heard of. If this story matters to you, share this video. Let someone else hear it. History that stays buried never gets corrected. And the least we can do for the Ojibway who perished at Sandy Lake in 1850 is make sure their story is known. Thanks for being here on Frontier Uncensored. I am Dustin. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment with your thoughts.